All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. The speakers are ready to start, right? Okay, perfect. My name is Stephanie Roman. I am a program manager for Hispanic in Philanthropy. I work in the United States, in Arizona, in the Tohono O'odham Nation land. I am very happy to be your moderator for this session, Understanding the Anti-Racist Struggle. We know that the anti-racist discussion is very dynamic and it is taking place in our working networks, in our personal lives, in our communities. And the objective of this hour is to contribute with keys of racism as part of oppressive systems and tools to create collective proposals for care and inclusion. The way we are going to be working together is by using the chat. So in order to make the most of our time together, I would like to ask you to ask questions, make comments, share your doubts and tools on the chat. Everything that you have done that is part of your effort. And today we have Ana Cecilia Perez, founder of Latino Racial Equity Power. We have Jose Antonio Aguilar from Racismo MX and Sebastian Frias from the Kellogg Foundation. I would like to give you a minute today to tell us how you're doing today and where you're joining us from. All right, maybe we can start with Ana. Hello, everybody. My name is Ana Perez. I am currently living in the Ohlone occupied land in California. I come from El Salvador, known as Tuzcatlan, and I am Pipil Nahual. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with you sharing today. Thank you. My name is Jose Antonio Aguilar, Director of Racismo MX. This is an initiative that started as a social network initiative to make racism visible in Mexico. Today, we are a civil association that works on the creation of campaigns and educational initiatives. Hopefully, soon we will also be able to do some research because racism as a subject has become very open, so to speak, in Mexico, but we still need to understand better how it works in other sectors, for example, and in terms of justice and in business. And so we need to really discuss that subject. Thank you very much for having me here today. Hello, everybody. My name is Sebastian Frias, Program Manager for the Kellogg Foundation. Right now, I am part of the Mexico team. This is my 9th year with the foundation, and I am very happy. I am really excited to be here with you today and to share this moment with you. I am in Mexico City. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I know that we are all ready to begin. And so, to start the conversation, let's start with Anna. Anna, could you share the context in the United States around what is happening? All right, so the floor is yours. Thank you. As you know, because of imperialism, what happens in the US is known everywhere, but it doesn't always happen the same way, the other way around. So we have heard a lot about anti-Black racism. We have seen that people have died at the hands of the police. And that is a result of structural racism. We know that a Mexican American child also died in Chicago. He was killed by the police. So, in the United States, a conversation has taken place, a very rich conversation. and organizations are pushing to have more racial equity. And as you know, what happened in Standing Rock, which is a very important indigenous nation that have been for hundreds of years fighting European invasion in the United States. So what I mean by all this is that the conversation is quite advanced. We have to understand that the United States is a nation that has been colonized by European peoples, and many indigenous nations have been subjugated. And by bringing Afro descendants to the continent to work in slavery, well, now there is more conversation around that. I would say that 5 to 10 years ago, talking about this was pretty much taboo. We could not do it as openly as we can now. And I think that now we have a higher level of acceptance, and at the same time, there are big challenges. It is difficult to change structures that have been there for hundreds of years. We can't change them overnight. So it will take some time to reform that. But we have to highlight the fact that police uh, bodies are born actually in the US because of slavery, because they were going after slaves that escaped. So that's part of the DNA, right? Like, why does the police exist? It is related to oppression, to maintain slavery, expelling indigenous peoples. And that's the root of a genocide that took place here and in Latin America as well. So I think that the restructuring of the police is something that's way deeper and that will take a longer time. So, in a nutshell, that is what's going on in the US right now. Yes, and I think that especially for the past 12 months, being quarantined has brought these conversations to the table, right? As Jose Antonio was saying, more is happening. That is happening more. And so, having said that, Jose Antonio, are there common elements in Mexico and Latin America, something similar to what Ana was saying? Maybe you could share with us what elements could be highlighted in this context, or also in the context of the fusion of different nations. Well, in Mexico and Latin America, we have some common elements with the US. I would like to mention three elements. First of all, the whole ideological structures, prejudices against certain communities, of course, the type of person that has that sort of racial burden. I mean, in Mexico, for example, it doesn't only happen with Afro descendant people like in the US. Here, we also have indigenous people and sometimes even people who maybe do not have an identity because of miscegenation, but whose skin is brown, and that is related to indigenous origins or Afro-descendant origins. So this whole idea of stereotypes and prejudices is something similar in both contexts. Discrimination and discriminatory acts is also another context. Uh, Police brutality, as Anna was saying, that also happens in Mexico and in the rest of Latin America as well. This is something that was inherited from colonization, that extractivism, that colonization, and so that's also very similar. And finally, we have power structures because racism is not only related to a particular act by one person to another person. This is a widely used discrimination concept, and there is also a systematic concept. So, racism is not only an individual or particular action, so, power is also another similar element. Now, if we talk more specifically about Mexico and our region, Latin America, what happens is not as visible. I believe that in the United States, There have been a lot of efforts to make this whole thing visible. I don't think that has solved the issue 100%, but at least there is a more advanced agenda and conversation. But as Anna was saying, in Mexico or in Latin America, there have been obstacles. There have been far more challenges to accept that this is a problem. And this is also related to a concept which we have here in these countries in the region about miscegenation. And sometimes people go like, oh, you know what, we are all the same, there is no racism. So it's almost like making differences invisible, especially the accumulation of inequality that has taken place over time. So I think that in our region, that is very particular. We are talking about that mixing. Uh, and In Mexico, I believe that the narrative when it comes to this mixes and miscegenation is different. I mean, it's not like it hasn't happened in other Latin American countries, but promoting this ideology is kind of different. But because of culture and ideology and the fact that we are close to the United States, and because of the efforts of revolutionary or post-revolutionary governments, that miscegenation narrative has been very successful. That is why I focused more on Mexico. Actually, I am in Mexico City, and that is kind of the core where this ideology was born, and that has been adopted by Mexican society. Actually, there is a motto used by the Mexican National University that says that my spirit will talk for my race. So I believe that over the past few years, and I agree with Anna, maybe in the past 5 years, the anti-racist narrative has been key. I think that things are more open. We are on the right track. However, we still need to work a great deal. This is just the tip of the iceberg. And let's not forget that racism is structural. So, in order to achieve structural change, it is not only about addressing the narrative. We need to really go for the structures and look at all of the extraction policies that have existed over time. Right. And I realized that you were agreeing. So before asking my next question to Sebastian, I would like to ask you if you want to add something to what Jose was saying. I would love it if you could show that slide, that map which I shared. I'm sorry, Sebastian, I will not take a long time because I'd love to hear what you have to say. But let's just remember that as a continent, the whole continent was indigenous land and is indigenous land, which has been colonized for over 500 years. So even if in the continent the concept of a race does not exist biologically, that was just a concept that was made up to steal land from the indigenous peoples, for example, from black people. But we do have indigenous people, European white people, Asian people, Arabs, uh, Afro Latinx, and of course we have a lot of mestizos as well. So that is the content. So when we talk about race and racism in the continent, that is what we are referring to. And I think that my two colleagues will also agree. So, okay, the floor is yours now, Sebastian. What do you think about all of this? Thank you very much. I would like to ask a couple things that are important. I think that for the foundation, it has been very important to establish certain parameters when we work in different countries. You have already mentioned that there is a history in every country, and it is really important to go back to that history to talk about racism in the different countries. Pepe was talking about the Nation Project in Mexico, then the revolution and miscegenation as an ideology. In the United States, there were also segregation and extermination, while in Mexico it was more assimilation, which has also happened in the United States, but that was more in Mexico. Like, how do we assimilate those identities? That's what people call a melting pot, right? That was different in Mexico. It was different to those processes. But I do think it's important to go back to that history. For the foundation, racism is basically that idea of a human value hierarchy, which is false. A system that organizes people, and some people have more value than other people because of their ethnic origin or their skin color or their language, and so on and so forth. Now, these hierarchies are different in every country, and that is why sometimes it's very hard to understand that. I think that it's complicated in Mexico. It is also complicated in Central America, to think about the fact that there is racism. uh, First of all, because the national project did not talk about race, right? If you ask someone in the US what's your race, they will know right away what you mean. But some studies show that in Mexico, for example, when you ask that question to people, they will not know what you're talking about unless you give them some options to answer that question. Then they will realize it is about ethnicity. So I think it's important to go back to the current confirmation of those racial hierarchies. And I also believe that it is very important to really make the voices of these people heard because we want to understand things from academia. That's part of a colonized project. And that was very important. 10 years ago, when we wanted to start talking about racism in Mexico, academia was a sort of barrier. People did not want to talk about race or racialization in Mexico. There was no diversity of voices. Most people in academia were, mixed people, part of the intellectual elite, privileged people, not necessarily people who underwent inequality processes or racialization processes. So I think that that is essential. Going back to history, going back to the voices of the people who are leading social movements, people who are leading the struggle to defend their territories and to improve their living conditions. So I think it's important to adopt this intersectoral approach. Racialized women, racialized teenagers and children, the LGBT community, racialized migrants. I think that is where we will really be able to understand all this. And just to complement on what Pepe was saying, I wanted to say that there is some confusion sometimes. Sometimes there is a confusion between abuse, for example, and racism. And some people talk about racism against white people, reverse racism. So I guess some people think that an insult, just by being an insult, that is racism. I think that that can be abuse or mistreatment, right? But when that insult is part of a whole structural system that prevents people from attending school or that makes the police kill them, then that is racism. When an insult is denouncing privileges, it is maybe not addressing that whole oppression system. I mean, we can all be offensive, we can all mistreat one another, but that's not racism. I think that those keys are important. So that's what I wanted to say right now. I love the way you are uh, saying things, Sebastian. And I would love for Stephanie to show us a picture of children because Sebastian was talking about intersectoral work, right? Like racism plus gender plus many things. So that's a cross-cutting approach. And I want to bring to the core children that have died in detention centers in the US. As you will see, the children that have died are Guatemalan indigenous children. What does that mean? That indigenous children from Guatemala have had to leave that territory. They have crossed Mexico and they have gotten to the US to be detained. So, what does it mean to have indigenous people knocking at the US door? The largest imperialist power in the continent, which is behind many anti democratic wars. And this concept of racism, how do we understand that colonization still exists even after more than 500 years, and there are still many economic and social problems that we are facing, and we need to think of what our responsibility is for indigenous peoples and indigenous children that have been excluded. How can we see them as a group that we have to make amends to? We have a huge debt, and we don't have to see them as, the guilty parties, but more as the actors of their liberation. So we are occupying their land. Before the Spaniards came here, indigenous peoples were, in conversations. Of course, it was not all great. There were wars, they were complex societies. But at the same time, there had been an exchange for thousands of years. We know that corn, for example, is considered mother corn by some indigenous peoples, all the way from Minnesota up north to Peru down south. And we know that corn comes from Mexico. So that is a key of the level of economic exchange, of commercial exchange, cultural and spiritual exchange that existed among indigenous peoples before the Spaniards came here. So it is important for me to say that history is not just about telling the story of what happened. History is so that we can exist, so that we can understand and develop real sustainable solutions, fair solutions that can take us to a different moment in our development as Latin Americans and as people. Thank you, Anna. Just as a reminder, when we are getting near the end of the session, we'll take your questions. Personally, it took me a while to understand why it was not enough to, deny being racist, or, to refuse to be racist. I feel that when you do that, it's like you are saying that you won't be racist, but you are not really fighting it. So that is why it is important to be anti-racist. Okay, because there is no neutrality in this fight. So the question for you three is, in your opinion, what is the importance of discussing anti-racism where we work, and challenging it when it happens where we work or in our community networks? Why is it important in the current context that you have shared? So let's start with Jose Antonio. First of all, we have to remember that anti-racism is not new. As Sebastian was saying, and as Anna was saying too, if we could maybe say that starting date, I guess it'd be the 500 years of European colonization. There has been a really important resistance by the populations that inhabited or inhabit the continent that we now know as the American continent. So that was part of a resistance movement. And that movement has lasted for 500 years. Of course, it is true that the media, economic systems, and the visibility of social networks have allowed all sorts of communication to flow. And from the point of view of Racismo MX, we have taken advantage of that. Of course, a whole debate could take place around that. Are we using the mechanisms of the system to criticize or to raise our voices? But I do want to say that anti racism is not new. However, having this critical attitude against the state and the whole miscegenation narrative and everything that has come from the police and from the state, well, that has helped open up the conversation, and we have concluded that it is not enough to say that we are not racist. We have to declare ourselves anti-racist. For a long time, there was some sort of denial that there was an oppression system, but now we know that it does exist. There are some studies that show us this information, and so that is why it is important to call for this union, and we have to say we have to be anti-racist, because otherwise the same thing will happen as it with other systems. For example, right now, nobody would say that there is no patriarchy or violence against women. Nobody would deny that historically speaking, there has been a homophobia or transphobia that prevented the LGBT community from accessing their rights. It's the same thing. When it comes to racism, it has to do with the DNA of how the Latin American states were formed and how they thrived from exploitation and extractivism. That is why it is really important to talk about anti racism. And it will hurt. It will hurt somehow because we are at a point where we are saying racism is not only affecting indigenous populations, of course, it has affected them historically, but racism is not only affecting Afro descendants, of course, it has, but it has affected all racialized people. Because sometimes we do not adhere to an identity, right? Because sometimes that miscegenation ideology is, I don't know, I would never say that I am indigenous, but still, I have experienced racism in my life. So, along those lines, if we talk about racism, and if we ask someone like, hey, have you been racialized? Well, that is a painful conversation with ourselves. But talking about anti-racism is also talking about privileges, as Sebastian was saying, because every oppression system is related to privileges that are created. And sometimes it's uncomfortable to talk about those privileges, right? Because some people are like, oh, I earned what I have, but not because of my effort. Maybe it's because of my inheritance, my raciality, my skin color, my sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a very important moment, and we have to state that we are anti-racist because some populations have been more vulnerable, historically speaking. That is very painful. It's very painful, but it's necessary. And if we have not done that before, I think today is the time to start. Okay, so Anna and Sebastian, same question. In your opinion, why is it important to talk about anti-racism? Why is it important in the current context? So I will call you Pepe. I realize that's how they call you. So first of all, we have to understand that racism starts with ourselves, right? Who are we? I disagree a little bit with Jose Antonio. All my life, I thought I came from poor peasants in El Salvador, and we had to flee because of the war. But where did we live with my family? In an adobe house, earth floor. We were making tortillas in a comal. We worked with corn. So everything was indigenous day after day. But because of miscegenation and because of that ideology of trying to erase the Indian part of us or getting away from that part, well, that is why it's important to know who we are. If I were in the United States in a reservation and I do not speak the language of my ancestors, well, still, it is important to mention at least the name of our people. When we do that, they are still alive. And that's part of the construction of a new anti-racial world where we can all belong. So I invite all of you listening out there to reclaim and honor your ancestors. That is a living form of resistance that sets the example. And at the same time, we have to adopt that cross-cutting approach. For example, I am indigenous, but I live in the US. I am privileged, I'm part of the middle upper class maybe. I grew up where they spoke Spanish, even though I was poor. I There was a school right there, so all of that is privileges, right? And that's different from an indigenous child coming to the border who doesn't even speak Spanish, right? So it's about understanding who we are related to how other people are oppressed. And Sebastian, that's part of the legacy, right? It has to do with this moment. So I believe that being anti-racist is about saying who we are related to these oppression systems, related to this history. And for me, this is kind of like what we know, what we are discovering together by telling other stories. As people say, the history is written by those who win. And so those who did not win, those who were colonized, what part of history do we need to understand? The history that lives in ourselves, in the problems that we face and that we have to solve. That is the anti-racist struggle for me.
And also for me, I I'm an indigenous. I'm a descendant of indigenous. So the way in which Europeans understood the indigenous compared to blacks was very different because, well, because of the discovery, they saw us as animals that we had certain level of humanity, but black people were totally seen as animals, that they did not deserve anything. So that concept, even when we suffered oppression, it was very shocking. And how can we talk about the genocide of 56 million people in all the continent in that period of the colonial destruction of 5 million Africans from the continent to be enslaved? So this is horrible, and we don't want to compare who suffered more or less, but we have to understand all these differences and how we are seeing with this concept, and how is this having an impact on how each community is treated in the own regional politics and policies of the region and the continent as a whole. So I'm always fighting against this anti-black, and I know that every day replicate the way I think when I see someone black, and the way that I react, and how I'm fighting to change these politics that contribute to this anti-black in the US and in Latin America. So it's not a simple thing like I am requesting or fighting for my rights as an indigenous. No, and that's it. No, I have to fight for my rights as an indigenous person, but I have to analyze how I replicate this anti-black attitude, and to have these conversations on how I'm supporting my brothers, my sisters, so that they come and that they say they are indigenous. Because, well, here in the US, if you have 1/4 of indigenous blood, you are indigenous, and you can look white, black, white or blonde or tall. But why is it that in Latin America, and I totally understand it, but how is it that they've sold us this idea of mixing, that we cannot even call ourselves and say who we are? So to me, that's the largest pain that I see. That's a pain that I still have. So thanks very much, and we have to be thinking all the time. We have to be reflecting on the way that we communicate, not just verbally speaking, but also in our body, like our body language, how we react. Just as you share this way of how we get to a space, to what's the intention that we bring to a space. And well, of course, I would also like now to give some time to Sebastian, if you could also share with us. Thanks very much, Anna. Thanks, Anna. I really like what you said. I like that you are accepting your vulnerability here, that you're speaking from the inside, because I think that anti-racism starts there, knowing who we are, and also to understand why we are in this fight, in this struggle, because it's a different struggle to us, but we do share that place and in the intimate thing that makes us be in this struggle. Now, anti-racism is like a trendy thing, like everyone wants to be anti-racist, everyone wants to explain and to support all these, and I don't think that's a bad thing, actually. It's a great progress of where we were 10 years ago, at least in Mexico and Latin America, not in all countries, but we did not even talk about this topic, so it's great progress. To me, anti-racism starts every single day, and just as Anna was saying, reflecting on who am I, where am I, how I react, what are the privileges that I have, what are the pains that I have, what are the oppression moments that I've been through, things that I still see in me that are a heritage of all this colonialism, and that my head and my mindset become rigid because we're colonized, but also feeling uncomfortable, or every single day feeling uncomfortable, and without being afraid of this discomfort, without wanting to forget it or neglect it right away. If racism is not making us feel uncomfortable, there's something wrong. If we are not uncomfortable by inequality, by everything that's happening in the world, there is a problem. And that does not mean that we have to be negative or lose our hope, because it's also well, lots of organizations and groups. Well, we if we are a privileged position, or we have a platform for sharing resources, well, on the one hand, we sometimes feel guilty. We are feeling guilty that we can't do more, that we feel that racism is our fault. And well, on the one hand, that does not allow us to move on. It does not allow us to change some situations. But on the other hand, we want to make racialized people responsible of these learnings, and to stop feeling this blame or guilt. So I think that blame helps us move, to make us feel uncomfortable, to move a little bit from the inside, but it has to be the first step. And the next step is, okay, I'm feeling guilty, but what do I have to do? What can I do? And to me, anti-racism is also every day to ask and to question myself. If the thing that I do, everything is changing stuff, if there's something practical changing, because if you just speak, I mean, that's not really helping. Visibility has a limit, and I think we've reached that limit. And yeah, there are a lot of people in society that we acknowledge that this is a problem, but we now have to modify it. But I think that's also very hard to find local examples, or examples that are close to us, because on the one hand, as Anna was saying, we have the news agenda all the time of what's happening in the world. It's very colonialized, and it's a focus at some stuff, but we're also very afraid of asking and question. We are very afraid of questioning why we have housekeepers at home, if the treatment that we have with them is fair, where they're from. It's really very hard to question our own privileges, how we make the others, and that's a two-end conversation, like on this, from the privilege standpoint, all the things that I do, what are the consequences that I'm having, and what's the oppression system behind them, sexism, capitalism, racism, all the actions that we have, they're connected because they're systems, and we all live in in these systems, and we're going to be part of that. But we also have this place from the inside. Anna, you said something that's very important to me and very hard as well. I think that on the one hand, yes, we do need to have that conversation of who we are, where we come from. But I also think that in countries in Latin America, there's a very thin line for the mixed race middle class. And that is that automatically acknowledging that we are an indigenous population, and that makes indigenous populations more invisible. There are elements of cultural appropriation, of speaking for others, or of taking the space of others. So yes, I do think that we are feeling uncomfortable. That is real. But knowing where we come from and this internal conversation and how colonialism has impacted us has also had that attention and that discomfort of saying, okay, these are these privileges that we have to be aware of, and we have to feel uncomfortable every single day. So, I'm closing my participation that this anti-racism is questioning, asking ourselves if what we're doing, what we're saying is truly transforming racism, if we are perpetuating racism, if we are allocating resources to the ones that have to have them, if we're giving the right salaries, if we're giving platforms for the people that have to take decisions, backing up, leaving space to them. That's where anti-racism is. Questioning ourselves every single day, how our actions transform our behaviors. Sebastian, if you could also share from Kellogg's, because we do know that there are people that are listening to this table that also work in philanthropy or a foundation. So what are the practices that Kellogg's is taking to have that self-analysis, that way of thinking, so that that you're working on anti-racist practices, but that you're actually working for communities? Well, I think that this is a very specific moment for philanthropy and for all donor organizations where there are opportunities and risks, such as these situations that happen throughout the world. I do believe that for the organization, the founder had the vision, Mr. Kellogg had the vision of financing communities and leaders that were historically excluded or neglected. And throughout the years, we started working on work of diversity and inclusion, that as the idea. And I thought that in the 90s, it was very revolutionary, but it was falling behind. And the next step that the organization did was declaring itself as an anti-racist organization. The board decided to do that, and it hasn't been an easy thing. I don't think that we can say that now all the actions that we have now as an organization are anti-racist, but I do think that's the highest level, deciding to take this commitment. This meant changing the way we were working on philanthropy, how we were giving grants to which organizations, which were the voices that were leading all those causes, but also internally. In the last 10 years that I've been in this foundation, there's been a huge turnover. We've tried to have a more diverse staff. Our CEO is the first Black woman to lead this organization in the US. So that was very important. But besides that, not just thinking in the gender quotas, that I do believe they are key as a first step. But okay, we have a diverse staff already. We already have this commitment. What are we doing here? How are we treating each other? So 2 years ago, we started an internal path to talk about racism within the organization. And this has definitely transformed the way that we're doing things, how we treat each other. And also this part of understanding that racism has a structural component, but that it also has a personal component that has been key. To us, this anti-racist work has two components. Yes, it's very important, this change in public policies, the decision-making process, stakeholders, but also what are the things that we have to heal as individuals for doing this work? Anna said it, how we have to reconcile with our own history, how we have to make pieces with our ancestry, to look at the others as equal, to truly see someone's eyes and to say, we are the same, we are equal, and we can have a different kind of relationship. And honestly speaking, I think that this is a very complex thing, and we have to bear in mind that philanthropy is a very uncomfortable and contradictory position. Resources, where they come from, how we share them. It's a world that's fully contradictory, but that cannot stop us from taking these extra steps or from having this conversation with ourselves. Being honest, like I'm here, I'm in a contradictory position, and I'm in an uncomfortable position. I'm in a position where I know that I'm not here just because of my effort, that it has to do with inequality, that I'm here, but what can I do from here? How can I go against that imposter syndrome that affects us, all of us? That's the only way to do so, being honest, having these conversations, and being vulnerable. And for that, I think that something that's very appropriate for the foundation is that each staff, they have their own path. Like we all have our own journey, our own path, our own life story, and it will take us like different processes to be able to heal, to accept, but we have to open this space so that people grow. And well, I've already spoken about all these practices and budget, the organization that we work with. I think that there's still a long path on philanthropy. Well, thanks very much. We are now in the last 15 minutes of our session. So I want to open it to questions. So I'm checking the chat over here. And panel members, if there are questions there, I think that Daniela asked, like, how do you relate these categories? The intersectionality. Anna? Pepe, Sebastian? You know what? I think that we've already replied that question when we had this dialogue. But then the one is that Daniela is very active. Thanks, Daniela, for asking. There's a relationship between the development, the hegemonic development, and the global north. That is to understand who am I, where am I in those stories, and what has defined those places and that storytelling. I think that we've spoken a lot about this and the storytelling, but I would like to challenge everyone that we are now at a crash of two very different cosmovisions, that indigenous groups from all over the world, because it was not just indigenous groups in Latin America. We also had indigenous people in Switzerland, in Africa, in Asia. So we are, we're talking here about people that had different cosmovision that from the ones from Europe. So that vision saw human beings as an additional element in a network of other living beings where humans coexisted with all these different realities. And the European cosmovision that's been promoted after colonization, and then the human beings are a supreme being that dominate and that use the rest of the planet. So to me, one of the questions that I think all the time is, how is it that we've allowed a European town with that idea, with that cosmovision? How have they colonized the entire world? And then in less than 500 years, we are about to extinguish life. And how can what can we recover of other cosmovisions to understand what civilization is having stuff that makes us kill the planet being civilization, or is it spending time with other beings and coexist with other beings for thousands and thousands of years? So to me, climate change, and the life crisis that we have in the planet, well, they have a lot to do with racism, colonization. Yeah, I would like to add something to this hegemonic development. And yeah, when it comes to storytelling, we have this idea, and Sebastian said it earlier. How is it that the middle class has adopted this storytelling of lagging behind? And there are indigenous towns and peoples and nations that are linked to being behind, because since they don't accept the Western way of development, so they are then natural enemies of that type of development. And well, in Mexico, we have this attention. We see this tension. We see it in these huge projects that want to be done by the state. That they're not new. I mean, these are two examples, but it's not that they're the only ones, and that this has not happened before. We have the Mayan train that you probably heard about, and all the problem around it, because this the imposition of this mega project has not been transparent. It has raised a lot of questions, and mainly what comes from that is that if you are against this project, then you don't want progress. You want to live in the past. Then you don't want to be formal. I have heard people saying like, okay, it will be a touristic place that will lead to some income. So you will finally stop being a farmer and you'll be able to work at a Starbucks. So who said that working at a Starbucks is development? So that is a challenge because it goes beyond just those comments. And the reality is that it's a belief that it has to do with mixed races, but also with what Daniela is saying, this hegemonic development. It's a fixed idea. And also with development, we have political organization. Well, they're advocates of this liberal democracy. That's okay, and that's the one that we're living. But that's an imposed model, a European model that was imposed without thinking about other community ways of organization that still coexist. And Sebastian already mentioned this economic system that, well, nowadays it's capitalism, but we do not see any other options that we could have, and this has now become a new kind of oppression with capitalism. So that was my comment when it comes to development. I would like to add something very specific that I think it's important when we talk about these hegemonies. And well, to me, there is a very serious risk when we ask who's right or wrong and what's behind that, who's right or who has the truth, who holds the truth. And I do believe that what should not happen is to stop these conversations. We should not do that. We should because when we focus all our cosmovision, our way of understanding the world in just one person and one leader in one organization in a movement, or whoever it is, we lose that capacity of going beyond, and we start replicating these fundamentalism ideas of thinking, or this fascism of opinions that we now see in social media. I do believe that, yeah, we have to do this work. It's not enough reading. It's not enough having very educated activities. Anti-racism has to start from having a dialogue, to being uncomfortable, to be, and not to cancel people. And by that, I mean, when someone has a different opinion to us, or that's a bit more radical or more moderate, not to close conversations automatically, because that is exactly where we're being a victim of the system that's imposing and colonializing stuff. So I think that dialogue has to exist. And of course, when we have conditions, I mean, we do not have to tolerate any types of violence, but I do agree that this has to be the first thing we have to do, dialogue, and to start contrasting perspectives and points of view, because I do think that for many countries and activism, we have these visions of what things should be and how they have to be. And to me, it's a diversity of voices. What are they saying? What's the Mayan community saying? What is the Latin community of migrants in Oaxaca or California saying, to contrast all these visions and to open up these spaces? Yes, and thanks very much. We are almost finishing our session, and Anna shared her email. And well, if you want to connect with the panel members, then if you could add your website or maybe the way of communicating with you. Perfect. And I think the last question, let me just check real quick here. Yeah, yeah, that was the last question. Okay, um, so if you have anything else to add for the audience, for the panel speakers, but I do think that this session, this conversation, is a conversation that can continue. And for the ones that are with us here, well, from the side of HIP, we've also started our own journey of being anti-racist. And it's not an easy thing to do, but we have to do it. And we have to start today. So, well, I just want to leave it open here to see if there are any other words that anyone else wants to share here. Well, yes, I've also shared some material here that's very important. If you haven't seen the documentary, well, it's not that I'm advertising HBO or anything, but that's a new documentary by Roel Beck that's called I'm Not Your Negro. That's about exterminating everyone. And it's a very important document because we can see how we were colonized. Colonization happened all over the world, not just in the Americas. So to me, this understanding of, like as Sebastian was saying, who's seen as a human being and who's considered a human being, from there, that hierarchy of who deserves what, and that leads to the problems that we're facing. So yeah, I would recommend you to watch it. And I also love it, and I think that we all share this same ambition and this work, that it's being being dignified, of understanding who we are, so that I can change all the material thing of people that have been more impacted by all these injustices. That's what being anti-racist is all about. So thanks very much for your attention. Thanks for sharing. And it's a great honor to be here. Well, yes, I would like to say that there is a lot to learn. I'm not saying that in the US we've already overcome racism. Of course, we know that that is not the case, but there are things that we can learn because the conversation takes longer. And I do believe that checking out how this conversation has developed on racism against Afro-descendants, or this systemic racism against people that call themselves Latin, or actually any other ethnic group, because there's a huge anti-Asian racism. So this can bring some light of which are the best practices to all these anti-racist people that work in the region of Latin America. For this reason, since I started chatting with HIP, well, I've been inspired because I've seen how they're doing things, how they've done it. And it's the same thing with Kellogg's and with Sebastian mainly. And I do think that we have to learn from all these best practices to be more efficient, to check also time, because we sometimes say, well, this is a process, this will take some time and some years, but we have to remember that oppression does not wait. And there are people out there that nowadays are being victims of this oppression. They have been displaced, they don't have access to water or education. So time is urgent, and it's right what Sebastian was just saying. We have to find the best way, and we also have to learn from the best practices out there. I would leave it there. And I thank you very much. It was an honor for me to share this panel with Anna, with Sebastian, with Stephanie. Thanks again for your invitation. Thanks. Well, it's hard to close after Anna's and Pepe's participation, but thank you again. Thanks, Keith, and thanks to everyone and all the audience. To me, I want to add something to what Anna said. This conversation that we have with ourselves, it's very difficult. The emotional work that we have to do in this anti-oppression environment, it's very hard. But to me, the invitation would be to be very sweet with ourselves, We have to be tender. We have to ask questions and to find things, because it's very easy to judge us and to judge others as well. And yeah, time is urgent. Yes, I do agree with Pepe. But if we don't solve our own wounds of not being seen, and feeling we're led, of feeling hate, everything around the systems, well, those solutions that we find won't be transforming. And I that's my own experience. I can share that. I've seen many initiatives that, since they don't go to the root cause of the problem, on how our hearts are broken by half because of this, it will be very hard to transform society. And I do believe that we can dare to be vulnerable with people around us, and also to be very strategic and very straightforward every single day. Both things can coexist together without a problem. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for being here with us. In the chat, you can see how to contact the panel speakers, but we're running out of time. But thanks very much. Thanks very much. We have more sessions so that you can keep learning. So long.